I was talking to a friend of mine this week who's on the security team at his church. And I guess that we're probably getting pretty close to where our security team needs to do its, I think it's semi-annual qualifying. And he was talking about the security team at his church, and I was listening to what he had to say, and he said something that kind of caught me off guard. He said, I've talked to his church, they don't have a biblical leadership paradigm per se. They have committees for things. And he said, I talked to the finance committee. He said, because there's something I want for the security team. And I was like, oh really, what is it you're looking to get? And he said, I want a taser. And I went, that's kind of odd. I said, I think most firms that handle that kind of security would probably recommend that you not go that route. And he said, why? And I said, well, sometimes if you tase somebody who's dehydrated, like a lot of times drug users and stuff are, they're ineffective. And he said, I don't want it for that. He said, I want the taser for our people, to keep them in control. And I said, well, that may be a different matter altogether. And we got to talking about something, and I didn't realize how relevant that was going to become. He started talking about the basic lack of discipline in our world today. And it seemed like everything for a few days there was just pointing me in that direction. And he wasn't talking necessarily about how we would think about it. If I were to talk to you about a lack of discipline, a lot of us would immediately go to disciplining children, and that's certainly lacking. But that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about personal discipline. And as we talked about that, I was reminded, and it just came through my mind, this passage from 1 Corinthians, and it's the 9th chapter. And I'm beginning in the 19th verse. And Paul writes this, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that by all means I might save some. So this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you." Paul here is talking about the things that he's doing that he doesn't want to do. Now, I'm going to tell you folks, if after church today, my daughter-in-law were to coerce me into going down to Witt's Custard, she's like that. It isn't hard for me to eat Witt's Custard. I don't have to drag myself in there to do that. This comes pretty easy. As a matter of fact, it doesn't take much discipline on my part to eat Witt's Custard. Think about yourself. All of the things that really destroy our Christian witness. Outbursts of wrath, losing your temper, carrying on and doing things that you shouldn't. All of these things, they require no discipline. When somebody cuts you off in traffic, you don't have to discipline yourself to say something you shouldn't. That just comes naturally. It just rolls right off the tongue. On the other hand, the things that we don't want to do, those require discipline. And discipline is sorely lacking in our world today. This past week, I don't remember what show it was we were watching on the Discovery Channel, but we were watching something. And while Sharon and I were talking, the show ended and the next show came on. The next show happened to be something about my 600, 700, 800 pound life. I don't know what it was. And I listened to this person talking about their life. Now, this person weighs well more than 1/4 ton. And they blamed their eating on everybody you can imagine. It was her mom's fault because her mom made her clean her plate. It was her sister's fault because her sister caused undue stress. It was the poor economy's fault. And everything down the line, I expected if I watched long enough, she'd blame her spoon and fork. But as it turned out, she had a long list of people and things in her life that were responsible for her current predicament. Now, this is true of us in our world today. We blame everything for the things we don't do that in reality, and if we're all being honest with one another, we never wanted to do to begin with. Listen to what Paul talks about here, and it's important that we pay attention to what this is and what Paul is saying and how big a statement this is. Here's something cool about the Bible, folks. We know that there had to be some validity to the book of 1 Corinthians. How do we know that? It survives to this day. We know that the early church, the first century, got this manuscript, and as they read through this manuscript, if Paul had been talking about himself in something other than what his life really was, then 1 Corinthians would have sounded like a tin horn. It would have been ungenuine, and people would have said, forget it. There's no point in reading that book, let alone preserving it. But when Paul says things like what he says here, for though I am free of all men, I have made myself a servant to all. When he says that, there had to be some validity to it. What Paul is saying here had to be genuine. And then he goes on to talk about things that we might just skim over. He says in verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew. Well, a lot of us might think, well, easy enough, Paul. I mean, you're a Jew. You know, that's your heritage. That's where you came from. You came from Judaism. You were Saul before you were Paul. And yeah, you were a Jew. But when Paul says that, we also have to keep in mind that those very same Jews with whom he shared kinship were trying to kill him at every turn. So Paul is saying, you know, here are the people that are trying to kill me. They're shouting me down every time I speak. They're on me every minute of every day, and I have become like them. When Paul went into a town, he did all the Jewish customs. He did everything that was required of him. And he tried his best to make sure that he kept himself in good graces with the Jews. He says he does this, and he does this for a purpose. This to me indicates that Paul was thinking about this. Okay, this wasn't something that just happened, that just came naturally to him. Have you ever known people who were just naturally gracious? I mean, there have been people in my life that I have known who are just gracious people. They didn't even have to try. Put your hand down, doubt all. That's not you. We've all known people in our lives who are that way, and this is just part of who they are. Paul says, you know what? These are the things that I had to do. These are the things that I had to force myself to do. He says to those who are under the law. Paul himself, throughout all of his writings, he says in numerous different places and in several different ways that the law itself was nothing more than a taskmaster. The law itself was nothing more than the light that shone on the sinfulness of man, yet there were those who believed that the law could save them. And they were utterly lost. But Paul says, when I'm around those people, I make sure I'm obeying the law in everything that I do. He says, these are things that I have done. He says to those who are without law, as without law. Now I want you to think about that for just a moment. What are the things that are in your family, those family dishes that we don't talk about very often? I've known of people who had haggis as a family dish. If you know what's in haggis, nah, baby, nah. I cannot eat haggis. That ain't going to happen. I remember going into my aunt's houses when I was a kid and smelling something, and frankly, it didn't smell like food. And I looked at my dad and I said, "What is that awful smell?" And Dad said, "Son, that's chitlins." Chitlins, of course, are the intestines of a pig. And when they're cooking, they smell very much like the intestines of a pig ought to smell. Not only do I not want to eat chitlins, folks, I can lose my appetite entirely. You know, if you come to Dowdall's house, for example, or maybe at my house in the summer, you might smell pork in the smoker. And to many of us, that just smells like that smells like a little bit of paradise. But you know, when Paul walked into the house of those without law, when Paul walked into the house of a Greek, he would smell the things that he had always disdained. He would smell the things, and as they were setting the table for dinner, he would look and he would see things that this is just not something a good Jewish boy eats. But he says, no, I became as them, that I might be able to win them. Now, I want you to think about it for a minute. You got Paul, he's walking through life. He's going through some town in Corinth, and Corinth had all kinds of awful things going on, but he's going through some town like Corinth, and as he's walking along, he encounters a Jew. And he disciplines himself so that the address and the greeting for that Jew is just right. And then he walks from there into the presence of someone who is under the law, and at that moment he makes sure that everything is squared away and that he is under the law. And then he runs into someone who has no law. And here again, he has to change who he is and what he's doing. How many people have you known, and boy, this is all over social media these days, how many people have you known to say things like, I just am what I am, and you can like it or not, right? Paul says, I'm a chameleon for the cause of Christ. Folks, this had to be something that he worked hard at. This had to be something that he was careful about. He had to discipline himself not to say the wrong thing at the wrong time. He had to discipline himself not to offend people. But see, discipline is what we lack. At prayer time, I mentioned my buddy Mike and the loss of his dad. Here's what I gather. Mike's dad, 81 years old, was leaving a friend's house after dark. And the police report says he failed to yield. But further, you find out, and I don't know how much of this to believe, and I don't know how much of it is accurate and how much of it is complete, but if you go on further, you find out that the person that hit John Pernstill was fleeing the police because he was driving drunk. So in the middle of the night in a residential area, he was going about 90 miles an hour. Every indication is that John looked out the driver's window of his car. He looked. It looked like he had all kinds of room, and he went ahead and pulled out and was hit and basal skull fracture is I believe what happened. Died instantly. My buddy shouldn't have to go through this. That being said, I hope that someday my friend can imagine that his dad lived 81 years, 80 plus a year. I hope that someday he might be able to come to the point to where he says, you know, Dad left instantly without pain or suffering. Boy, it could have been way different than that. I hope that someday my friend can look and see the sovereignty of God. But you know what's in the way? Somebody went to a bar or at home or whatever and drank and became to some degree or another incapacitated. Didn't have the discipline to turn down the drink. Didn't have the discipline to find some other way home. Didn't have the discipline to give someone else his keys. And he got in a car and he started the car up, and as a result of events that began right there and just couldn't be rewound, John Pernstill, father, grandfather, trustee at his church, instantly was killed. Folks, we are going to learn what it is to pay the price for lacking discipline. We're already seeing it with our kids. We are already seeing it with our kids. We have teenagers killing teenagers. We have teenagers that are strung out on drugs. We have teenage alcoholics. All kinds of violence and terrible, horrible things. Because those kids were never taught discipline, and furthermore, they never saw discipline at home. Why do we lack the discipline to do these things? Paul in 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23 is talking about hard things. He's talking about hard things that we have to do in Christ. We lack the discipline to do that. Well, why is that? Because we lack the discipline to do much of anything at all. We do not have discipline anymore. 1 Corinthians 9:24, just the next verses after that passage I read. He says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it." Now that's very simple talk, folks. He says, "Do you not know that all those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize?" And then he says, "Run in such a way that you may obtain it." We have to discipline ourselves to run this race. I very seldom watch track and field at the Olympics, but you know something I like to catch is at the end of the marathon, they almost always do a lap or two inside the stadium. And you're watching these guys, and they've already run 25.7 miles, which to me is insane. But nonetheless, they've already run 25 plus miles, And then you see them on that last lap. And how many times do we see one or two runners that are just doing everything that they can do, and they're leaving it all out on the track? And this race that was 26 miles long comes down to 100 or 200 yards. And you know what, folks? By the time you've already done the insane thing and run 26 miles, that last 0.2 ends up deciding the race. And you know what it comes down to most often? Both of them are tired. They're both exhausted. What it comes down to is, who wants it? Who wants it the most? Everybody runs. Everybody's got a race to run. But how bad do you want to run the race and win? Now that's the question you've got to ask yourself right now. And this is a question that parents have to ask themselves. This is a question for preachers and church leaders. This is a question for every one of us. How bad do you want to win? How bad? Are you willing to leave it all out there on the course? That's how you win. That's how you win. And that takes discipline. He goes on to say, everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. In other words, he's saying they've all put something into it. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Folks, do you not know that the things that we are doing and the events of your life have far greater implications than a race or a contest? There's much, much more at stake. Again, Thursday night, somebody went out, they were having a good time. Now, their good time involved imbibing in alcohol. The next thing you know, they're driving down the road and a policeman lights up his lights. Why? Well, I don't know. Maybe the policeman saw him roll a stop. Maybe the policeman saw that he didn't indicate a turn, which would normally be no big deal. I mean, if I turn a corner and didn't turn my turn signal on and the policeman pulls me over, that's no big deal. I'll stop, we'll talk, and chances are, when he finds out I'm not drunk, he'll probably let me go. He couldn't do that, though, because he lacked the discipline. And his lack of discipline has cost people dearly. You're running for you, my friend, but you're running for something much, much greater. Verse 26, he says, therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Have you ever listened to commentary on some of these races, particularly distance races? This is something that amazes me, and it's always amazed me with Sharon. You know, Sharon can watch, and you know, she'll be watching basketball. The other night I came home from bowling, and I opened up the door. And when I opened up the door, I couldn't see, I don't remember why, but I couldn't see exactly what was going on in the house. I opened up the door, and I said, hey, hon. She goes, hi, honey. And I said, hey, I'm home, okay. And then she goes, what in the world are you doing? So immediately I look at my feet, because I mean that's the first thing I can think of. I've done, and well, I walk around the corner and I find out she's talking to the OSU basketball team. They're getting beat, and she can sit there and she can watch them come down the floor. And as they're coming down the floor, and to me the whole thing's happening way too quickly, but she can watch them come down the floor, and she's like, well, they're in a 3-2-3 or a 1-3-1 or a 6-5-4. I don't even know what this stuff is. She knows the defense that's there. She knows the offense that's there, and she's seeing this stuff in real time, and she's seeing all of that as she goes. I've listened to commentators on a race, and they're talking about the last 40 yards of a 200-meter sprint. And in that last 40 yards, which takes what? maybe 5 seconds. It takes this guy a minute and a half to describe what he just saw. Well, he went into this, and then he was doing this on his lane change, and he did the right lane change, and then his arms were doing the right thing, and then he went into his kick, and he sits here and he talks about this, and he can talk about the last few feet of that race for a minute and a half. Because he's that tuned in to what's going on around him. And he understands I don't. Or the things that I don't. Because here's my strategy. If somehow or another I were to end up in the Olympics in the 200-meter race, which is probably not going to happen. But if it did, you know what I would do for that last 40 meters? I'd run and run and run and run and run. I'd just run hard as I could run. Keep running, run and run and run and run. You know what I would have done for the first half of the race? I'd just run. I wouldn't have worried about economy of motion. I wouldn't have worried about what my stride looked like. I wouldn't have worried about anything. I'm just running. That's what I'm doing. Paul says, we don't run with uncertainty. We've got a plan, and we're sticking to our plan, and we're sticking to this. He says, therefore, I run thus, not with uncertainty. And then he says something I guess I understand a little better. He says, thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. My brother, he fancied himself a boxer. And I guess he was pretty good at it. I think he was helped greatly by the fact that he was 6'4", 6'5", and he had arms that were like 7 feet long. That was probably the biggest thing that he had going for him. But he decided one day that what he needed to do was he needed to go and enter the tough man competition. So he came up to Dad and I and he said, guys, I'm going to go fight in the tough man. Would you help me with my entry fee? And Dad said, absolutely not. And I was like, well, Dad, why not help him? And Dad said, because he's going to get his head knocked off. And Danny's like, oh, no. And he does some moves and he jukes around, makes a few jabs and that kind of thing. Well, the night came and it was over in Marion. They were having the big tough man fight over there. And I didn't go because I loved my brother. And from what I understand, basically when they hit the bell, Danny came out and he was in his best boxing stance. And he's ready to juke and jive. And out of the other corner came the Tasmanian Devil. And he was all feet and hands and swinging and everything else. And before Danny knew it, he was in big, big trouble. And the reason for it was he didn't have a plan for what he was about to encounter. Paul says, you know what? I don't fight just to beat the air. I have a purpose in what I'm doing. Folks, we need to make sure that we have purpose in everything that we do. We need to make sure that it is with purpose that we deny ourselves. Okay? It is with purpose that we deny ourselves. But we also must make sure that it is with purpose that we allow ourselves. Now, folks, this is inside baseball, right? It is with purpose that we deny ourselves. There are things, my friends, as Christians, we just should not do. And we deny ourselves these things for a purpose. I will not do this that my witness wouldn't be hampered. I will not do this so that I'm not taking a chance. I will not do this because there's too much at risk. But we also have to be careful and put just that much thought into the things that we actually do. Paul says, I fight not as one who beats the air. he says, I have a plan and a purpose in the things that I'm doing. I'm not just running to run, I'm running to win. And folks, it is necessary that we do the same. I don't get certain things. There are certain things that I do not understand, and I would pray and beg of you that if you believe that it's okay for you to drink, please, if you're going to drink, don't drive. At all, I'm saying. I'm saying don't do it at all. Because if something does happen, and bad things are going to happen, if something happens, then everything that you have done to this point and everything that you will do from this point on is going to change because of a decision that you made. Do you realize that you don't have to be drunk, but just impaired? Do you realize that you can be impaired by alcohol, you can be impaired by illegal drugs, or you can be impaired by prescription drugs? And what's going to happen is if the normal things that happen in the course of human life occur, if the normal kind of thing that happens, you know what, I didn't see him. You know what, I lost control. Even if the normal things that happen to people all the time, tragically, but happen all the time, you are going to pay a tremendous price for that. And not only that, if you have a brain and a functioning heart, would you not be asking yourself for the rest of your life, was I just that much slower? Was it imperceptible? But it could have made all the difference. How long does it take to swerve at 50 miles an hour? And that much input into your steering wheel, how far does that change you? A second away, a half a second away. We have to be careful. And you know the thing, though? The thing is, and this gets us throughout our society today, folks. This gets us everywhere. This is why kids get zeros on tests and don't understand why they flunked. This is why they have to give trophies to everybody. This is why marriages dissolve. This is why families can't get along. We lack the discipline. Verse 27, Paul says, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Let's back this up a minute. We go all the way back to 1 Corinthians 9:19. Paul is making an incredible list here of things that, as we discussed before, had to be true. He's saying, these are the things that I have given up for the gospel. These are the things that I have denied myself for the gospel. These are the things that I have done for the sake of the gospel, to spread the gospel, to share the gospel with those who desperately need to hear it. Beginning in verse 24, he talks about all the things. He says, you know what, I've put my effort into this. This isn't something that happened by accident. This is something that I have planned for. This is something that I have devoted myself to. And he says, I am running, I am fighting in such a way to win. And then he says in verse 27, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest, he says, when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Paul presents himself as a spiritual giant. And in the midst of all of that, he's still concerned not for the souls of all the Jews, and not for the souls of all those under the law, and not for the souls of the strong, and not for the souls of the weak. He says, after all of this, and after living a life of discipline, I am still concerned that having done all that I have done, I myself would become disqualified. Now, I don't know where you stand, and frankly, I don't care. I don't know if you're once saved, always saved. I don't know if you believe in backsliding or anything else. And I am being as serious with you as I can when I tell you, and this is from the bottom of my heart, I don't care. But I will say this. If Paul is concerned about disqualification, you better be concerned about disqualification. I don't care who you are. I don't care how great you were. I don't care how wonderful things are that you have done. This is the guy that wrote most of the New Testament of the Bible. And he says, I am concerned. I'm concerned about me. Folks, that is the only thing that will give you the discipline to do the things that you must. That's all. Nothing else will. My dad tried to quit smoking. He smoked for 20 years. He tried to quit smoking, I don't know how many times. He set him down, and the next thing you know, he's smoking again. And then one day, and I believe it was about 1984, I got home from work in the morning, and Dad didn't make it to work that morning. I was wondering what was going on. And I called up Barb, that was his girlfriend at the time, and I said, where's Dad? And she said, oh honey, don't you know he's in the hospital, he had a heart attack. Now this is before cell phones and everything. So I go to the hospital to see Dad, and turned out they were getting ready to release him, and he's getting dressed and everything. And he looked at me and he said, I quit smoking. I said, you did? He said, yeah. And I was thinking, well, we've seen that happen before, right? He quit smoking and never picked another one up. Because his doctor walked in, sat down on his bed and said, Wayne, you got a choice. You can smoke and die, or quit and maybe live. Dad said, you know, that focused everything for me in a way that I could understand. It was the fear of the consequences of his own action. That's what changed him. Listen to what Paul says here. Paul says, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that in the midst of all of these great things I do and all of the great things that I have done, that I myself might become disqualified. I think we're over COVID. I don't know, at least for right now. You see, the problem with COVID, I'm afraid it was a lie from the beginning. And when it exposed itself as a lie, nobody feared it anymore. Nobody feared it anymore. Folks, they've done this with a lot of things. And you know, once the lie is exposed, we lose our fear. Know that this is not a lie. Even the best, even the greatest, even the most notable among us were concerned about their spiritual condition day by day and minute by minute. Jesus looked at the apostles when he was getting ready to leave them, and he told them this. They were to go and share the gospel with every creature. Every creature. And he said, and he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, but he who does not believe shall be condemned. How hard is that to believe? How hard is that to believe? When Jesus said that his yoke was easy and his burden was light, man, he was telling the truth. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. There are religions in this world that require you to beat yourself senseless, travel halfway around the world, do all kinds of crazy things. But his yoke so easy, burden so light, that he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. But here's where the discipline comes in. You can't make it on your own. You just can't. You just cannot make it on your own. Our invitation hymn today